Folks, let's pray and we'll launch, okay? Let's pray. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this time to be together and for us to continue to keep learning. May we always be open to learning new things, and that what you will share with us, Lord, is something that we can perhaps share with others. And always it helps us to be better disciples in this world, to love and care truly for all people. Thank you for Dave and for his willingness to participate and share of his expertise. And we ask your Holy Spirit's guidance and blessing upon us all. Jesus, we pray this in your name, for you can make it all possible. Amen.
Amen. All right. So I'm going to share my screen, and let me do this. And then, okay. And is that looking okay there, Jean?
Yes, it looks great.
You can see my screen and you can hear me. Okay. All right. Well, I'm Dave. Many of you know me. Probably more of you know Michelle, my wife, who's sitting to my left here. She's been active in the church as she was a librarian for a number of years, and she was actually kind enough to be librarian for some of the information I wanted to pull together for this talk. My title of the talk is to help us to try to, we're going to talk about the biology of addiction in the brain, and the concept that addictions of various kinds are really brain-based, not just psychologically based, but chemically and probably anatomically based in the brain as well, sort of all of the above. So just in terms of what I do for a living, I'm a clinical professor of neurology at University of Washington, and I direct the Neuroscience Institute at UW-Medicine, Valley Medical Center, which is down in Renton. We have 4 hospitals in the UW-Medicine system, University Hospital, Harborview, Valley, and then up in North Seattle, Northwest Hospital. My special area of expertise is beyond neurology is epilepsy, and I'm the vice chair for the Clinical Activities Council at the American Epilepsy Society. Let me see if I can get this to advance here. There we go. So I always like to start with an outline so people kind of have a sense of the flow of what we'll talk about. And I'm going to be very careful to not use medical terms, but some of them will be unavoidable. So I'll define them as we go. We'll go over a little bit of terminology. I'll go over some of the statistics of addiction and what it means to Americans and what it means to Washingtonians. And this is one of the areas that Michelle helped gather some useful data for this talk. I'll talk then about the brain disease model of addiction, because this is sort of newer stuff in the last several years, and I'll try to keep it simple. And this is a place where, like, please interrupt me if I'm not doing a good job keeping it simple. And then I really want to just focus on how can we as Christians help at the end of the talk. And there'll be plenty of time, I hope, for free discussion and open discussion at the end. I don't purport to have all the answers, and I'm not an addiction. I don't practice in addiction medicine, so it's a little bit out of my area to talk about this. But I have quite a bit of experience, and I thought I'd try to share that. So our mission is to grow in Christ and serve, love and serve all people. And that means not just some of the people, but all of the people, to love them, embrace them, and serve them. And so we'll really be focusing today on our brothers and sisters who sometimes can be rather hard to love and serve when they're in the midst of addiction. It can be really challenging. And so service to them and love, despite the problems that they're having, is something that we want to aspire to. We'll talk about some of the biology of the brain to help us understand what is addiction and what it isn't, and also why it's so hard to break the addiction cycle. I'll be talking primarily about drug addiction, but it applies equally well to alcohol addiction. There are other behavioral forms of addiction which I'll kind of outline, and I won't really be talking about those. So I should have reversed these. So you can have substance use disorders, also sometimes called chemical dependency, that can range in severity from mild to moderate or severe. By definition, from the American Psychiatric Association's down at the bottom, you'll see the DSM-5, that stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, version 5. They define a severe substance use disorder as an addiction. Now, again, there are, so we're saying that substances, obviously you can have addiction to substances. You can have addiction to behaviors, obesity, pathologic gambling, video gaming, promiscuity, others. We're gonna just set that aside, and that's not really part of today's talk. And I think maybe Pastor Tim Weber or somebody who's more of a psychologist could speak to those a little better than I can. But I will talk about substance use disorders, and just to name some of the substances, because I just have so many patients. I'm a practicing physician, and my patients don't understand what are narcotics, what are opioids, what are tranquilizers. Let me just separate those a little bit. So everybody's familiar with alcohol. We know what that is. Opioids, another term, are narcotics. In fact, the original term was narcotic. Narcos in Greek means sleep. Like narcolepsy is a disorder of sleep. So narcotics were, in the old days, in Greek days and Roman days, was thought to induce sleep. But they come from the opium plant, so that's why we call them opioids. So they could be everything from Vicodin, which is hydrocodone, to oxycodone, which is Percocet, stronger, OxyContin, which it can be a patch or a pill, all the way up to recreational street drugs that are illegal, class 1, schedule 1 compounds like heroin. Tranquilizers are something different. Tranquilizers I can think of as something to either decrease anxiety or to help with sleep. And the chemical name is benzodiazepines. So that's a class of drugs. And those, again, are usually used not for pain like opioids, but rather to help people cope with anxiety disorders or sleep. Cannabis you're all familiar with, and then there's, of course, cocaine, which is a powerful stimulant, and methamphetamine, which is another powerful stimulant. But there also are prescription amphetamines that are used sometimes to treat some disorders like ADHD, and those can be abused as well. They can be diverted for recreational drug use. So moving back to the bottom, the DSM-5 has a definition of what a substance use disorder is, and it's the recurrent use of alcohol or other drugs which cause clinically and functionally significant impairments in one or more than one area of life and living. So this can be health problems, which of course we see lots and lots of in hospitals, disability, and failure to meet major responsibilities in places like work or school or home. So if you're having these impairments and you're recurrently using drugs or alcohol, you then by definition you have a substance use disorder. Some of the statistics here are really pretty sobering. And let me move my little speaker view out of the way here. It's always going to be in the wrong place. There we go. So 0% of addicts say that they wanted to be one. It's not something that people aspire to be. Everybody has had other dreams or other goals in their life. And in this, if you will, kind of happens upon them for a variety of reasons. It's very common. So almost 1 in 10 people over age 12, that equates to somewhere around 20 to 22 million Americans are addicted to alcohol or other drugs. And these are data from the National Center for Drug Abuse Statistics from just last year. And Michelle pulled that data, and I looked at some from 2013, and they were the same numbers essentially. So nationally, this is pretty interesting statistic that 18% of individuals in the last month have used some sort of illicit drug. These could be marijuana, cannabis, opioids, as I said, the painkillers and narcotics, prescription drugs, and even inhalants. So that's a pretty staggering number, 1 in 5 individuals. That doesn't include alcohol.
David, let me interrupt. Is
Yep.
an inhalant something like vaping? Is vaping?
No, vape. No, it'd be more like people that huff like refrigerants or other kinds of volatile hydrocarbon chemicals to get themselves high.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, you do inhale, nicotine vape, but that's specifically just to get the nicotine into your body. So Washington is not doing well. And this is data from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS, that we rank 5th out of 50 states in illicit drug use. And I didn't know that we were that high. I wouldn't have actually thought that. So that's a pretty sobering statistic. Some data from the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute at the University of Washington, you see the logo in the top right. They found 5 years ago in a survey that over 14,000 Washington residents were admitted to hospitals for treatment just of opioid addiction alone, not other addictions, but specifically opioid addiction, which is almost 2 times what we've had thus far in the COVID-19 epidemic. If you look from February to the present time, October 11th, we have had about almost 8,000. So that's a lot of people admitted for opioid addiction. If you look at the number of people who are admitted annually for overdoses, it's 77 people per 100,000. And believe me, at my hospital, we see all kinds of this all the time, with consequences up to and including death, which is shown in the following, the last point, the bullet point there, that 1 in 5,000 people in Washington state died in 2018. And that represented almost a doubling from 15 years earlier. So pretty sobering stuff. How do we begin to understand this? We were talking, Gene and I were kind of talking a little bit earlier, and we were saying, like, how many families have not had, how many people do not know someone who has a problem with addiction or had a problem with addiction? I would say, I would venture a guess that probably 90% of people know someone who's had an addiction. And I may use the word addict, and it sounds like a derogatory word, and I don't mean it that way, because while I don't like it when people say, oh, I have diabetes, therefore I'm a diabetic, and I absolutely detest it when my patients with epilepsy say I'm an epileptic. I always tell my patients, you're not your disease. Please don't do that. But in addiction treatment and in addiction therapy, they do refer to themselves as addicts because it's part of the therapy. It's part of that 12-step process that I'll go through at the end. You have to admit that you have to admit your addiction. And so they will refer to themselves as an addict as part of the therapy and recognition that it's a daily, 1 day at a time, a step-by-step, 1 day at a time process. First step is admitting you're an addict or you have addiction. Anyway, so addiction is a brain disease. So despite a lot of growing scientific evidence and research that's been done, and all of the advances that have been made in treating and prevention that have come out of this, some people still question the concept that addiction is a brain disease. And it goes back to sort of these ingrained values and belief systems about us as individuals, that we can determine our own path, and that we're responsible for our choices. And when you are thinking of, in that way about it, it kind of frames drug use as something that's a voluntary, kind of hedonistic, selfish, I'm in it for a good time kind of act, a choice. And also, the problem that some people have raised is if you say, well, addiction's a brain disease, then how does that lead to just, well, we just are going to excuse them for they don't have any responsibility for their own personal well-being? Are they exempt from being prosecuted for criminal acts that they may take on or act out to gain access to drugs? So I'm not going to get into those questions. Those are big questions, and I'm not an ethicist, and I'm not smart enough to answer them. So I'll stick to the concept that addiction is a brain disease. And there is this disease model, which I'll go over, and it really kind of explains the disruptions that people under the influence, or people who are actively in addiction and trapped in addiction and haven't entered recovery, the difficulties they have with decision making and with emotional balance. So here's a brain, and my favorite organ. And I became interested in the brain when I was a college junior or senior. I think it was junior, actually, in Rochester, New York, at University of Rochester. I was doing biochemistry. I'm a biochem major, and I took a course in neurochemistry. And I remember sitting in my fraternity house one day, and I was one of the few fraternity brothers that actually read the newspaper. Some of my other brothers were busy doing other things that they probably shouldn't have been doing, but maybe working on their addictions even. But I remember reading the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle in 1978, and I read an article about this guy, Solomon Snyder, at National Institutes of Health, who had discovered endorphins. And at that time, there were even the pre-peptides of those called enkephalins. And I was like, these are the natural narcotics in our brain. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. That really sent me on a path for the last 42 years, going down the path of neuroscience, and to this day, I love it. I show you this. This is basically sort of three aspects of the brain. On the left side, here it is. If you can see my pointer, this is the outside of the brain. This is the right hemisphere. And as you know, we have two hemispheres, the right and the left. This is the right side, and this is the outer surface of it. I'll just keeping it simple here. There are 4 lobes of the brain. There is the frontal lobe, so named because it's in the front of the brain. The parietal lobe here, which is for physical sensations. The occipital lobe, which is the vision lobe back here. And then the temporal lobe, which is down here. If it kind of looks like a boxing glove to you, the temporal lobe is the thumb of the boxing glove. If you were to slice these two hemispheres apart and look at the inner surface, that cut surface, that's what you see here. And then if you looked at the undersurface of the temporal lobe, bottom right here, you'll see that there's a lot of different structures here. So many of these structures are very, very important in addiction. It turns out that, moving back here to the left side of the screen, the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe are critically important in addiction. If you move to the inside of the brain, this cingulate gyrus here is very, very important in addiction. And the underside of the temporal lobe here, the parahippocampal gyrus, and things that are under that are very important. And I'm not going to get into this except to say, I just wanted to point out there's all these interconnected pathways in the brain. And while the blue strip here is the sensation area, and the red strip is our movement area, and the orangish, whatever that is, tannish kind of color here is hearing, and purplish blue back here is vision. There's all these other integrating areas. So they're all interconnected. The brain is not these sort of little standalone castles that just do vision, hearing, movement, and sensation. But obviously there's all this networking that goes on. And so networking becomes absolutely incredibly important. And also we have to keep in mind that this is just the surface of the brain. There's all these deep structures in the brain, in the center of the brain that are also interconnected and important in addiction. And I'll show you those in a minute. So basically, the way to sort of conceive of the addiction cycle is that there are 3 stages, and it really is a cycle. It goes in a circle. It begins and involves binging and intoxication. So first, the addict starts out and tries the drug and gets intoxicated, and they get a reward from doing that. And then they get into the second cycle, which is the withdrawal, and then the third cycle, they're thinking about getting high again and preoccupied with it, and pretty soon it becomes literally a cycle that goes all the way around. Then that'll lead from, it starts with intoxication one time to repeated intoxication to then binging, and it becomes something that is repetitive.
David,
Yes, Jean.
I have a question from Jill. As our brains are evolving and changing with environmental factors and natural changes, are we seeing more people leaning towards addiction?
I don't think so, Jill. I think we're seeing, I think addiction is, we'll get into this, that it is genetic. It has a genetic basis. It definitely can run in families. But that said, there are environmental influences, and there are environmental reasons why people can wind up in the cycle of addiction. And addictions and the things that people are addicted to change over time. We're seeing, in my view, and again, I'm not an expert, as I mentioned at the outset, but in my view, we're seeing more novel kinds of addictions, gaming addictions, video game addictions, or something that didn't exist before we had video games. Facebook addictions. I mean, I'm thinking, Jill and some of you are friends with me, and I think I have a little problem there. I think so. I think you can. I think we can get. Most of us can probably get addicted to anything, and the reasons actually. That's a great segue into this slide. The reasons I think are contained in this slide, and I wish I had a better pointer. Maybe there is one here. I don't know how to do that. I'm kind of zoomed on. But anyway, so let me go through this. I hope I answered your question, Jill, and if not, we'll come back to that. So drug intoxication, how does it actually, what happens in the brain? So you use a drug, whether it's alcohol, whether it's heroin, your mom's prescription, oxycodone or Percocet, which you stole from the medicine cabinet, whatever. The chemical that's released in our brain in response to any kind of addiction, including video games, compulsive gambling, etc., is dopamine. And some of you, in the abbreviation in neurochemistry is DA. So dopamine, if I write that, that's what that means, it's dopamine. And some of you may have, learned some neurology and learned about these kinds of things and say, well, I think, isn't dopamine the problem in Parkinson's disease? Isn't that what goes wrong? There's not enough cells or neurons in the brain that make dopamine, and that's absolutely true. And it's also deranged, however, in things like schizophrenia and other what we call psychotic disorders that are characterized by hallucinations and delusions. And so there you have overactive dopamine. So don't confuse those two medical conditions, and both of them are medical conditions, absolutely, neuropsychiatric conditions. Don't confuse that with the transient, temporary dopamine release you get in response to a pleasurable activity. So that the problem with the dopamine release is it trains our brain it releases a reward. It feels good at the time. Of course, when we feel good, especially if we've got troubles in our life or we've got, aches and pains, why not feel good? If you're feeling bad, it's nicer to feel good. And over time, this repetitive pulse, release of dopamine, feeling good, reward signal, it conditions us to do it again. Just like Pavlov conditioned his dogs, he would, ring a bell and he would feed them and they would salivate. And he would ring a bell and he would feed them and they would salivate. And then he would ring a bell and he wouldn't feed them, but they would salivate. They had become conditioned to the stimulus. So that's what kind of happens. We condition our brain into doing it repeatedly. And what really is what's sad about it is that the more you do this, the more repeated times that you use a drug or whatever it is, the brain cells no longer respond. They no longer fire in response to the dopamine that's being released, but instead they respond to the cues in the environment that predict the delivery of the substance, the reward. So the cues are often, hey, who do I, inject heroin with? What does the room smell like? I think some of them even burn it. Cocaine, they, I guess, smoke it or snort it. When it's like, oh, yeah, so put it on foil and heat it up, and it has a certain smell. That is a potent. It's actually more potent than the actual drug itself. And also the addict's mental state before the drug was taken, that can cue them to get the drug. And it turns out they've measured this in animals with electrodes placed in the brain, and these cues become triggers for faster surges of dopamine release than the actual drug is, and the cues are what cause cravings, what motivate drug-seeking behavior, and ultimately what leads to binge usage of the drug. So dopamine is really, really key. And another stimulating neurochemical, something that I'm interested in because it's important in some cases of epilepsy, is called glutamate or glutamic acid. And you might say, well, that sounds like something that's in Chinese food. We add monosodium glutamate or MSG to food to make it taste better. And actually it is true. That actually is the same thing. And our taste buds are reacting to that too. That's that fifth sense of taste, that umami taste, that's glutamate. So dopamine and glutamate are the important neurochemicals that are involved in intoxication. Now, the second step, and I think I want to try to get through these 3 steps, and then maybe I'll definitely take some more questions at that point, Gene. The second step is then the withdrawal. Okay, the high is over, the opioid, the whatever, the alcohol is being metabolized by our liver's getting rid of it, it's no longer in our body. Boom, now we're coming down. We're going into alcohol withdrawal, we're going into drug withdrawal, and with opioids, they get the so-called the cold turkey. You've heard the term cold turkey. Well, that means that's because they get goosebumps all over their skin, and they shiver and they shake like a turkey that's been plucked and is cold, literally. That term, that's where that comes from. So what happens here is that during this stage, this is where the addict spends a lot of time, unfortunately, during the day or during the week. And so ordinary, healthy types of rewards, things like relationships with families, relationships with loved ones, just doing activities, going out for a walk, enjoying going to the botanical garden, eating out and enjoying it, listening to music, they lose the motivational power that they used to have. The addict just becomes what we call apathetic about really doing these things. They remember that they were pleasurable, but they no longer hold the sort of motivating power to go out and do it. And their brain systems basically get conditioned to focus more on this potent release of dopamine that I talked about in the previous slide. Initially, it's this dopamine release is triggered by drugs, but now it's triggered by cues, and they just become totally focused on that. And their total experience, their life experience, becomes having these cues and triggers, and the drug intake that triggers. So what happens is that even when an addict is put into detox or voluntarily goes to detox and say, okay, that's it, I'm not going to take any more of this stuff. I'm going to go into 3 days of detoxification. I'm going to go through the cold turkey, the shakes, and after alcohol abuse or alcohol cessation, you can have epileptic seizures. They used to call those, by the way, when the British sailors would sail all the way from England and go to the Caribbean to buy rum and bring it back to England, they would trade goods for rum. And takes tax money back. They would go to port in Jamaica or whatever. They'd go out and get drunk. They'd come back to the ship. The ship would set sail. And on the way back to England, they would be having epileptic seizures, which in the old days they used to call rum fits. So there's all kinds of withdrawal in that detoxification process that occurs depending on the substance that the patient's with or the person's withdrawing from. But unfortunately, once detoxification's over, these patterns of behavior that I talked about above can't be immediately reversed. It really takes a lot of time. And so most people will enter 1, 2, 3 month treatment programs to reset their thinking. So with this repeated drug use and that any kind of stress that comes along, the negative emotions become overwhelming. And the person is trapped in this, what we call dysphoric state. Dysphoria is the opposite of euphoria. Eu means good, dys means bad. Those are the root words. And so you're in this dysphoric state, hopeless, horrible state. And that basically the addict now is just taking the drug because of repeated use over and over time. They're taking the drug simply to get relief from this dysphoric state. So the third phase of the cycle is what the things that they become preoccupied with things, and they're anticipating that next fix, that next high. And this is where the frontal lobe of the brain that I spoke of, the biggest lobe of the brain, begins to change. It's hard to measure this, but we know that these are frontal lobe features. So they can't regulate themselves. They don't, shower, shave, brush their teeth, go to the store, go to appointments. They don't attend to things like they should. They make all kinds of crazy mistakes in decision making. They can't be flexible in changing, from doing one activity to another. They have trouble with what they call salience, which is where they assign value to things, though this is more important than that, or even monitoring errors that they may make. They don't even realize the implications of that. And it weakens their ability to resist strong urges to take drugs and to follow through on quitting. And so many addicts will be literally so very sincere. They want to quit. They know they should quit. They hate their life. But at the same time, they're impulsive. And they're unable to follow through on making that kind of a commitment because of this preoccupation and anticipation stage. So I'll show you one last sort of diagram here, and these are the 3 stages kind of broken out in a diagrammatic format. And before I get to the 3 stages, let me just kind of point to, you'll remember that I was showing you the outside of the brain, and now we're showing it as sort of a visible brain, if you will. And notice that there are 3 different areas that are in color that are present. Some of them them are present on the surface cortex of the brain, the frontal lobe here in green, but many of these are deep subcortical. These are called subcortical areas. And Layla, who's on the call, I hope she's still there, will be the only one that will recognize any of these most likely in this. There's another nurse or doctor on the line. So I won't really get into these, but except to say, I'll try to pull this together that you're talking about networking between the cortex of the brain, the gray matter of the brain, our thinking part of the brain, and more of these deep centers. These are gray matter areas too, but they're different. So again, the binge and intoxication, stage 1, this is what's involved in drug taking. It activates the blue reward systems here. So things like the globus pallidus, the caudate nucleus, these areas are involved with the cortex in reward that comes, and these are areas, as Layla knows, contain lots of dopamine. And so you take a drug and the dopamine just surges in these areas. When the drug wears off and the patient enters this withdrawal phase, top right here, the pink areas have become involved. These are the emotional areas of the brain, things like the amygdala. This is involved in rage, fear, anxiety, the nucleus basalis down here, and other areas. These deep subcortical, these are ancient areas evolutionarily in the brain. And they're involved in stress and reward. These are kinds of areas that'll get activated when, let's say, animals or humans are being attacked by, let's say, a carnivore. If you were being chased by a lion, your amygdala would absolutely light up. So this is the fearful, bad, uncomfortable part of the brain networks. And then this third area, the preoccupation, this inhibits the prefrontal cortex and orbital frontal cortex's ability to abstain from drug, even when the person's, they're trying to abstain from it, but there's just so much desire to take it. They're thinking about their next fix. So really down here in if you can see where my arrow's pointing, these stages of addiction change over time, and there are neuroadaptations that occur. At first, when you use a drug, it makes you feel euphoric. But over time, you no longer get the euphoria, you just kind of feel, okay, sort of good. But as addiction goes on and on and on for long periods of time, now you're using the drug just to get rid of the dysphoria that you have. And likewise, withdrawal and negative affect, a negative mood, affect means mood. Here you have reduced energy, now you have reduced excitement, and here you're feeling anxious, restless, and depressed all the time. This is the progression from the brain changes that are occurring as addiction goes on. And with preoccupation and anticipation, maybe you're thinking, hey, that'd be fun to go out and party with my friends again. We did that a week ago for the first time. That was kind of fun. And then you get into this really desiring the drug. And then finally you get into obsessional activities and planning to get the drug, even criminal activities to get the money to get the drug so you can buy it from whatever. So those are the stages, and this is from this article that was in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine. Was a nice review that was done a few years back, and so I just want to give credit to the authors for that article. So that was a lot of material, and I'm going to step away from the biology of it now because that is probably much more than anybody wanted to know. But maybe, Jean, are there any questions at this point?
Yeah, Jill had another question. If there are medications that can intercept in the orbital frontal cortex?
Yeah, no, Jill, not that we know of. The orbital frontal cortex and the frontal lobe is very involved in personality, planning, judgment, organization, attention, humor, IQ, and it is the largest lobe of the brain and is networked into all other lobes, and there are literally hundreds of neurochemicals in the frontal lobe, one of which is acetylcholine, which is, if you smoke a cigarette, or if you, or vape, like somebody like Gene asked, you're taking in nicotine, and nicotine stimulates those acetylcholine receptors and kind of activates and alerts your frontal lobe. So there's lots and lots of chemistry there, and the problem is it's you can't just take a drug and it's going to go and affect one area in isolation. Really, you're talking about a supercomputer, and the networking is so complicated that whatever medication you might give to affect one chemical is going to have effects across the brain, and the effects are so widespread, and then networking leads to changes that basically occur all over the place. So it's one of the problems with a neurochemical approach to treating any of these disorders is the neurochemistry and the electrical networking and interconnections interface so much that you can't separate one from the other. But it's the frontal lobe that really, it's the judgment, the behaviors and such, that's what really affects the family relationships and choice of behaviors so much. I'm sorry, that was really, a really crummy answer, Jill. It's super complicated, just mechanistically, and that's why there is no drug that just is going to treat frontal lobe problems. God, I wish there were. Yeah.
I just want to say to the rest of the participants, we're at 11:30, and Dave, if you're willing to continue, but if some of you have to go or whatever, please feel free to do so. But I'd like to go ahead and finish this, because since we're recording it, we can, if you want to pick it up later, you can do that. Okay.
Okay, and this from here on out, it's pretty light. I'll just say that these are some of the risk factors that we know for addictions. To family history, exposure. As I mentioned, exposure is an important thing. If you don't have access to it, it's going to be hard to develop an addiction to it, and it usually starts in adolescence. Socially stressful environments, poor social or family support, easy access to drug, limited other alternatives. And I think that's where, I think those of us that have had addiction touch our families, many people come from, have great upbringings, good family support. They've done all kinds of things, Boy Scouts, sports, Girl Scouts, you name it. And these things can still happen. Then other risk factors are pre-existing mental health conditions, things like depression or anxiety disorders. ADHD, particularly untreated ADHD, has about a 20-fold increased risk of yielding or going on to have addiction problems. So we've talked about this. This is just kind of a summary, and I'm going to kind of leave this as this is a summary slide of really what I was talking about, this model of Volkhaus and all that I just talked about. So what can we do? Because addiction can happen to anyone, literally anyone. You don't have to have any risk factors. So understanding these things is helpful, but how do we intervene? So certainly in school-age kids who exhibit novelty seeking or impulsive kind of traits, or who are struggling with hyperactivity, impulse control, there are treatments that behavioral treatments that can be used. Medications can help with those kids too. So kids with, let's say, adolescents with significant, or younger kids with significant attention deficit hyperactivity disorder can benefit from drugs like methylphenidate, Ritalin, and also behavior. And it turns out that if you treat the behaviors with psychological means and the meds together, that's the best way to try to and that will actually reduce the risk of getting into addiction. We now have lots of other medication treatments, as are mentioned here, and I'll skip those. Social contact is important. Exercise is important for the addicts who are trying to recover. Getting out, exercising, literally smelling the roses, having contact only with people who are in recovery, and eliminating the people who are not in recovery. Changing your circle of friends is really, really important. So what do you do when it's your family or a friend that's struggling, that's really succumbing maybe to this? You have to understand that the underlying vulnerability of the addict is a lifelong thing. And as sad as that is to hear, and as hard as it is to acknowledge, and as cruel as it might sound for me to say that, it is the truth. And I think the first step, one of the first steps in the 12 steps of how do you deal with this is recognizing that addiction is a disease, and it's not a moral shortcoming of the person. It's a disease, it needs to be treated, and it is forever. And so 12-step programs have been around for forever. And the reason is because they work. And many of you, or maybe all of you, know about them, but I'll just kind of point out, I talk to patients, families in my practice about this, and sometimes that my patient has a son or a daughter or a spouse or a brother or sister or a parent that has a drug or alcohol problem. And I tell them, you can't do much for the addict, but you can do something for yourself. And the first thing is either to join Al-Anon or Nar-Anon, because these are the groups that, in my experience, have a proven benefit. You can't help someone until you help yourself. It's like the old airline thing, you know, when the airline masks, when the masks drop down, what did they tell you? If you've been on, well, we haven't been on airplanes recently, or at least I haven't, but what they used to say was you put your own mask on first and get that oxygen flowing, because you're not going to be able to help others until you take care of yourself first. So this is what Al-Anon and Nar-Anon are about. I want to read these powerful words because this is the Nar-Anon about addiction statement, and this is read at the beginning of every single meeting every week. We've learned that addiction is an illness. It's a physical, mental, and spiritual disease that affects every area of life. It can be arrested, but never cured. We found that compulsive use of drugs does not indicate a lack of affection for the family. It's not a matter of love, but of illness. The addict's inability to control the use of drugs is a symptom of the disease of addiction. Even when they know what will happen when they take the first drink, pill, or fix, they will do so. This is the insanity we speak of in regard to this disease. Only complete abstinence from the use of drugs, including alcohol, can arrest this disease. No one can prevent the addict's use of drugs. When we accept that we are powerless over it, we become ready to learn a better way to live. And I think this is just a powerful statement, and there's a reason that it's read at every meeting, at least in Nar-Anon, and I think it's part of sort of the mantra. It sums it all up, I believe. And there are the 12 steps here. I'm going to just briefly go through them. We admitted that we're powerless over the addict. Our lives have become unmanageable. If that's where you are in your journey, please go to Nar-Anon. Please go to Al-Anon. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. We made a decision to turn ourselves over to God or our higher power as we understood him. Nar-Anon and Al-Anon are spiritual groups. They're not religious groups. You don't have to belong to a particular denomination, but you need to have a concept of your own higher power. It's a spiritual movement. You make a search of yourself, an inventory of yourself, and you admit to your higher power or God and to yourselves and to another human being what you've done wrong. And it may be, again, if you're not the addict, by the way, these 12 steps mirror exactly what Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, what the addicts say. They're kind of translated for us, those that are in contact with addicts. So we say what we've done wrong, and maybe how I talked to the addict, maybe how I enabled the addict, maybe how I was codependent with the addict. And then we're entirely ready to have God remove these defects and ask him or her to remove these shortcomings. And it kind of goes on from there. So really, that's kind of where I wanted to end, Gene. And I, welcome discussion. I welcome, opening it up to really everybody discussing it together, because I am, as I said, this is not my area in which I practice. I've been touched by this in many ways over the last 42 years in medicine. And so, I'll stop now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's open up for comments or questions, or anybody want to share something. Yeah, Linda.
Well, I had a question for Dr. Vossler. I've been a volunteer at the Pediatric Interim Care Center in Kent, which treats newborn drug-addicted babies. And many of them are born polydrug addicted and go through a lot of terrible withdrawal symptoms. And they've been there a little over 20 years, I believe now. Maybe 25, something like that. So they have been able to follow some of those babies into adulthood, but I think that's a continuing thing. So given that they were born addicted, and so there's perhaps both the already addicted as well as biological things, what do you kind of feel that their prognosis is?
Linda, thank you for that great question, and thanks for what you've done for these young children. So there are, unfortunately, if there is gestational use of drugs and alcohol, in other words, throughout pregnancy, during what we call gestation, the fetus in the womb, there are absolutely, especially in the case of alcohol, biological, physical malformations that occur in the body as well as the brain. And some of you may have heard of fetal alcohol syndrome. Right. And Dr. Zamarodi, there she is. She's on her mom's shoulder. Maybe would recognize fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS is it's an actual physical, you have dysmorphology of the face, right, and behaviors. And some of these children have permanent, lifelong behavioral acting out behaviors. So, and again, once the kids get beyond the actual physical withdrawal of the cocaine or the heroin or whatever, methamphetamine, there's a range of problems that occur that are beyond my scope. I'm not a pediatrician. I don't do this. There are people who do this work at Seattle Children's Hospital.
Mm-hmm. So I do know that the University of Washington for years has done studies, long-term studies on people with fetal alcohol syndrome, as well as those who are a little bit less affected, fetal alcohol affected, but they've, I think studied them up regularly every year up to age 20, and then every 10 years, decades, after that. But I didn't know if there's that kind of research being done on fetal drug addiction.
You're absolutely right, Linda. It's changed names. It used to be called the CDMRC, the right. Center for Mental Retardation and Child Development at University of Washington, right at the UW hospital campus there on Portage Bay. And they're still there. They have a different name, and they had an active federally funded program to look at that and track them. I'm certain that that's being done for drugs as well, but I don't know if UW is doing it, but I'm sure it's being done around the world. Absolutely.
Kit.
Hi, I was just wondering, you mentioned the 12-step program, but also you hear a lot of advertising, like with Schick Shadle with the aversion therapy. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so Shadle and other programs like that. What's the one that's up in Kirkland? I'm blocking on the name. Milam recovery. Those are Kit, the sort of the 1 month, 2 month, 3 months kind of programs. They I don't want to speak exactly for Shadle because I'm not familiar with what they do, but they are typically 12-step based. But think of it this way: basically, someone who's going through immediate drug withdrawal and they're in that discontinuation, that 3 to 4 or 5 day drug abstinence phase. That's sort of like being in critical care, and then these Shadle, Milam, recovery program, Lakeside Milam, other programs like that, in state and out of state. That's kind of like being step down care, getting ready to be released to home. But the 12-step programs of Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous, which are for the addict, and Nar-Anon and Al-Anon, which are for the families, that's home maintenance. That's long-term maintenance. I mean, the Shadles and Lakeside Milam, they use a 12-step program as well, but they're just kind of getting started. So it's a lifelong process.
I think if I could jump in, many friends and loved ones of addicts feel that when their loved one comes home from detox, when they come home after a month, that they're going to be fixed. Woohoo, good to go. That is just the start of recovery. Recovery takes the rest of their life because of those brain changes. It takes so long to undo them. And frequently they can never come back to their home of origin because too many triggers are there. So there are things in place called Oxford houses, for example, where addicts can live in a clean and sober 10-step, 12-step environment for a long time until their brains heal.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, Joe.
I just wanted to add something off of what Michelle had said, as far as after initiating recovery, returning somewhere other than where you came from. And Marv, maybe you've heard this before, but a sort of short and sweet phrase that I really was able to understand was, if nothing changes, nothing changes. And for me, that was really powerful. It's something that I tell patients a lot when they're struggling, and sort of the idea of how do you come back, and, you know, what does the future look like? And when it's a matter of saving your life, those struggles, the obstacles we're all worried about.
I just wanted to add in some commentary about the role of families in recovery. As family members, we learned a lot about what's involved in an alcoholic's recovery. And at that point, they didn't have Nar-Anon. It wasn't a thing yet, right? So kind of everybody got to go to an AA program and an AA retreat. And they spent a lot of time working with family members talking about this concept that Layla mentioned, that nothing changes, and articulating kind of how much the family can play a role in that. And so in addition, there's a 12-step recovery program kind of, you know, beyond Nar-Anon and Al-Anon, which is really amazing for people that have active addicts in their lives. But beyond that, there's also Codependence Anonymous. And Codependence Anonymous kind of takes sort of the next step, which is not necessarily about managing your life along with in context of the life of an addict, but sort of what's your role beyond that and how you function, and maybe the habits you might have as an individual that contribute to that person's being stuck.
Thank you.
Well, what kind of damage is done to the brains that can lead more to epilepsy or can lead to other health issues that you may see all of a sudden they're in the hospital and it's affected something else of their body?
Well, Jill, it kind of depends on the, and Layla, you know, chime in here too, but it kind of depends on what drug you're talking about. Of the drugs, in terms of medical complications and lethality, and I'm not talking about lethality from, you know, like going and robbing a store, because you need money to get a fix from your pusher, and getting, shot by the police or a gang or something. I'm not talking about that kind of lethality, which is what Layla, I know you're a surgeon. I mean, she's going to deal with that kind of lethality. But what I see is alcohol is by far the most lethal drug out there. It causes myriad problems. I could literally spend a day going over all of the health complications from chronic alcohol abuse to discontinuation, sudden withdrawal and going into status epilepticus. These people will have continuous convulsive seizures. The other one that's actually really bad is cocaine. Cocaine causes hemorrhages in your body, hemorrhages in your brain, can give you a heart attack, and absolutely can make you have seizures. So meth also can give you, and they can give you cocaine, and meth can give you strokes. Meth can give you seizures. Narcotics, don't get me wrong, I think that there's a reason they're a Schedule I drug. Heroin, fentanyl, this kind of stuff, you're not likely to die from them. You're not likely to have strokes, but what they do get is, because they're shooting this stuff up, is they get infections into their heart, they get sepsis, they'll get basically these what are called vegetations in the heart. Basically, they're clumps of bacteria and cells in the heart, and they're infecting the whole body, and then they can shoot off and give you strokes. So lots and lots of bad things can happen as a result of the use of these drugs. But I would say just, big paintbrush, alcohol's the worst, and I think cocaine and meth, medically speaking, are next to that. None of them are good, though.
Dave, Bill has a question about how would you distinguish between mental illness versus addiction?
Well, it's a good question, and it comes up a lot. And one of the slides that I kind of briefly touched on is lots of people, as I mentioned, have a history of depressive disorders. It could be bipolar disorder, what we used to call manic depression. It could just be major depression, anxiety disorders, ADHD, I mentioned a couple of times. And even frankly, many of them have had sort of psychosis, and Layla will know that, psychosis is considered the most common condition that we think of when we think of psychosis is schizophrenia. But there's others, schizoaffective disorder and others. But so the problem is, when I'm not a psychiatrist, but for my psychiatry colleagues with whom I work every day, they're always trying to disentangle, right? How much is drug abuse and how much is underlying and even pre-existing. And even maybe it was sort of masked mental health conditions, psychiatric conditions, and how do you disentangle them? And the psychiatrists will tell you they can barely crack that nut until you get rid of the substance abuse stuff and get them off the drug. There really is almost no hope in sort of treating the mental health issues. And so at least our psychiatrists are like, until you go through detox and until you go through recovery and are in active recovery for the rest of your life, I really can't do much of anything. I mean, they may give them antipsychotics to kind of quell the voices or the delusions if they're psychotic, but the mood disorders, which is anxiety and depression, very, very tough to treat.
Any other questions?
I want to add that before Jean closes us out, that St. Andrews and St. Margaret's just up the street both sponsor 12-step groups for addicts and for family and loved ones. Those have all, of course, moved online, but they're readily accessible and anybody can join. So that's something you can always refer to somebody else.
Yep, just go to the Nar-Anon or Al-Anon website if you're a family member, and just you'll see where's the nearest group, and just click on it, and they'll tell you they're almost all over. If you're living in a little bit more rural area, it might be a little bit farther to drive, but in the Puget Sound area, they're plentiful.
David, I just have to Say real quick, thank you for that first slide, reminding us of our mission statement of our church, and that people with addiction, and I think with 20, yeah, and I'm thinking
That was Michelle.
I'm thinking with 2020, you know, we're going to see a lot more of this coming forward. They've already shown alcohol sales going through the roof. And, you know, people who are self-medicating during this very difficult time, to remember that these are the least of these. And that's exactly where Jesus would be sitting, is with these people. So that touched my heart deeply for you to start this out. Thank you.
Well, I credit where credit's due. That's Michelle. And I think kind of keeping it as Christ grounded. I think that's really important.
Yeah,
We
amen.
don't often talk about addictions. There's quite a bit of stigma. There's no reason really we shouldn't. And thank you all for your interest in helping to explore just one more group of people that are suffering.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dave, so much for the preparation and for the very informative. I mean, I learn something new every time I watch and listen. Folks, thank you very, very much. Again, David, thank you so much. Thanks for being willing to do that.
My pleasure.
You bet. And we look forward to more. And I'm sure you know Dave's email. So if you have other questions or such, you know, feel free. And I know Michelle will read them. And so if Dave doesn't get him, Michelle.
Oh, no, I'll
Yeah.
get him. I might not get to him for a day or two, but, and by the way, call me Dave. No more Dr. Vossler stuff.
Great. Absolutely. Thank you, Dave.